In Margaret Atwood's poem Dutiful, she explores the resignation to self-sacrifice's lasting impression. She does this through employment of rhetorical questions, circular structure, natural imagery, ramping diction, tonal shifts, and minor rhyme. To create her rhetorical questions, at the very beginning she first states, "How did I get so dutiful? Was I always that way?" This is meant to imply that she is now examining her previous exploitation as a child, which she then goes on to explain in how she would go around cleaning up messes she did not make, and it got to the point where she would begin to volunteer herself. As she progresses, however, in the second stanza and final stanza of the poem, she repeats this rhetorical question format in asking why she still feels responsible. This is meant to somewhat close the discussion that she has opened within the poem about how she is now examining her ingrainment of this need to self-sacrifice, especially when at the beginning of the poem she feels responsible for things which she has no ability to control. This lends to the circular structure that she creates. The circular structure between the beginning and the end is meant to not only signify the closing of the discussion, but to also create a resignation to the place in the universe that she's created for herself. She now realizes that as a child, she simply did so because she was asked to, often equating it to slavery and not performing these tasks willingly, until at the end, when even after she tries to give up and say, "No, I will not be doing this anymore," she instead still feels the responsibility and somewhat self-guilt at allowing these things to occur. Throughout the poem, she uses a lot of natural imagery, specifically in attempting to find a way to explain how she is interred as an indentured servant to all those around her. In the beginning, she says, "Sweeping up dirt I didn't make." Later on, out into the yard with a stunted rake, weeding the gardens of others. She then references dirt blowing back, weeds flourishing, and wanting to dance by the river. This is also lending to the circular structure throughout the piece, however, because as she resigns and says that she is no longer going to sacrifice herself to the will of others, and she uses eating flowers I didn't grow as an epitome of that no longer caring for the beauty and the self-sacrifice that she had once had to make. She's now taking from others where instead she had given. In the second stanza, she creates ramping diction and at her final shift to basically give the feeling of how deeply interred she is and how deeply responsible she feels for everything and how ingrained it is in her as a person. She says, "Still, why do I feel so responsible for the wailing from shattered houses, for birth defects and unjust wars, and the soft unbearable sadness filtering down from distant stars?" None of these things are as obvious are things that she would ever be able to control, such as sadness from distant stars, or the wailing from houses, birth defects, and wars, which she would have no social context with. This ramping diction is meant to mimic her feeling of helplessness that originally begins as something small and simple that she may be able to intervene in, the wailing of shattered houses, to something that she has no ethereal ability to connect to, which is the unbearable sadness from distant stars. It is meant to mimic the near guilt that she feels and near depression that she feels because of her inability to partake in any form of fixing the issues that have occurred. There are multiple tonal shifts in her poem, such as with many of her other poems, i.e. The Moment, Either or Sekhmet, where she begins to create a false tonal shift in order to create an idea that something is fine, when in all actuality, at the final shift, she implores the reader to look at it with a more distinctive eye and see that instead nothing can be changed. For the first stanza, it maintains the same contemptive tone. Throughout it, she is questioning why she has been forced to become a slave to those around her and to instead sacrifice herself. At the end of it, she states that somebody ought to do something. That was my hand shooting up. It is not meant to mimic that she is being outgoing or trying to take initiative, but is instead showing how she has simply become this person that must give away because it is simply in her nature. There's a false tonal shift between the first and second stanza. As with Margaret Atwood's other poems, she tends to use syntactical shifts between stanzas to help get across a tonal shift. Thus, if you have read any of her others, you begin to believe that the second stanza is going to be different. At the very beginning of the second stanza, it gives a resignated tone, where she is trying to cast off this idea of her self-slavery and her indentured need to completely give to others. When it gets to the third sentence, however, which is actually posed as an elongated question, it becomes the final tone, which is instead self-guilt. This self-guilt is meant to say that although she may put on a front and although she may be attempting to cast off how she had once been a servant to all of those around her, she still cannot shake the feeling that she must still do something. Finally, she used minor rhyme within the poem to create not only a beat to the poem, but to make transition between thoughts. Although it contains a major theme of not allowing self-sacrifice to completely take over a person's being, she has multiple statements within it. Between sweeping up dirt I didn't make, or out into the yard with a stunted rake, she then transfers into something of no longer just doing as a child would be told, but instead taking it upon her own efforts to become this person. Her next rhyme, for other people's fecklessness and my own slavery, I didn't perform these duties willingly. She goes on to exaggerate how she had been forced into this idea as a young child and now must maintain it. Something had me by the back of the neck, that's me 2 years later, a purple-eyed wreck. How she has become this person now. She is the purple-eyed wreck versus saying that she is simply mimicking this idea of an indentured slave. In the second stanza where she says, I've ditched the grip of my echo, it drops down 2 lines to rhyme with, adorned with the gold word no, and eat flowers I didn't grow, in order to create this idea that she is casting it off, that she is no longer attempting to be this person that she feels she shouldn't. However, the last 4 lines create an A-B rhyme scheme from shattered houses, unjust wars, unbearable sadness, and distant stars that don't quite rhyme but create a near enough rhyme to create an almost anxiety within the reader as they should rhyme, but instead leave you feeling as though there is something that should be fixed that simply can't. Thus, in her poem Dutiful, Margaret Atwood explores the resignation of self-sacrifice and its ingrainment into a person through the use of rhetorical questions, circular structure, natural imagery, ramping diction, tonal shifts, and minor rhyme scheme.
You talked about how this poem links to her other pieces through several different techniques she uses within her writing. How does this poem link thematically or stylistically with other Atwood pieces?
I believe thematically it matches with the majority of her pieces that examine such as the role that people have within societies, such as Helen of Troy does counterdancing, where it tries to take this resentful tone against this idea of judgment, but instead ends up lending to the idea that it's unable to be cast off because raised in a society where it's simply expected. She has this with a lot of her more social commentary poems.
And you discussed the escalating imagery in the last stanza. How does the sound she refers to, those sound imagery, the wailing, how does that lend to the piece?
I believe because when you hear wailing, it almost is an onomatopoeia because the way that it just kind of drags out tends to be high-pitched and has this unfortunate screech almost to it. It is supposed to lend to that unfortunate anxiety that you feel that you can't quite control. She says it with soft, unbearable sadness filtering is almost a sound in and of itself because when you think of sadness, you think of a low minor key.
Let's spend some time talking about Haroon and the